Welcome to our burgeoning discussion of all things Roman. This time we're going to be getting together and we're going to talk about the Romans, first the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire. So I'll actually be breaking this up into a couple of different pieces. It's all one slideshow, but I want to deal with the rise of the Roman Republic, Roman culture, and then the Roman Empire, dealing with a long stretch of time for this great and important civilization, one that's going to have a huge impact on the world going forward as we talk about this. And so we've got a lot of terms, we've got a lot of different topics to talk about, whether it's government, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's military. The Romans were pretty violent people, so there's a lot to discuss here with the Romans. In order to understand the Romans, though, we got to back up a little bit and deal with their preceding culture, and that's actually the Etruscans. The Etruscans had taken over what would be Rome and governed it and implanted a lot of the cultural traditions that the Romans are later going to use to grow into a great civilization. Some of these examples of what the Etruscans, how they lived and how they passed this on to the Romans were, they liked living in walled cities. They were highly urbanized. This idea of walled city, one, for protection, but two, concentration of social activity into this urban space, is something that they're going to pass on to the Romans, and this is going to be an important facet of what the Roman concept of how society was supposed to work. That it was urban, the city was where everything that was important was taking place. You had to have a countryside, you had to have farmland, you had to have trade routes and things like that, but the city was why you had that, so that you could go into the urban space and make things happen in society. The Etruscans had adopted an alphabetic form of writing that had been taken from the Greeks. There were Greek cultures that were living down in the southern part of Italy. They had borrowed this. This is, of course, an important formation point for the Romans with their own alphabet. You and I would recognize this as Latin. Now, they had been in charge of the Romans. They had conquered it as a province for about 250 years until the Romans finally ejected them by force. There's actually a little bit of gray area in the historical record about when exactly the Romans kicked them out. Was it really final? Some, maybe they came back and then the Romans kicked them out again. But eventually they will be gone and the Romans will be using themselves, but they will have a great deal of influence on the Romans. These guys were road builders, they were wall builders, they built temples, they built public buildings, and of course these are going to be some of the main hallmarks that we'll notice with the Romans a lot later. Well, after the Etruscan kings had been kind of forced out, and then some of these puppet Etruscan kings had been forced out, the Romans really veered away from the idea of top-down, monarchical, essentially dictatorial rule, and they wanted to create a government that could get things done, because the Romans were very practical people, but wouldn't allow some type of dictatorship to take over, some kind of king. So what they decided was to create a government called a republic, or res publica, ruled by the people. But they based this on their concept of imperium, right? Imperium, which was the right to command. The idea was that if you're going to be in charge of things, you have to prove that you have a right to do it. Either you're elected by the assembly or you're deferred by various councils. Something has to give you, based on the people, the right to command. Now, once you had that right to be in charge of whatever, it could be garbage pickup, right? Then you were in charge. But you had to have that right first. So on the one hand, they wanted to kind of spread the peanut butter. They wanted to spread the power out so that you didn't have a dictatorship, that you based this on the people. But at the same point, they understood that you had to have some kind of governmental control, that you couldn't just have everybody be equal all the time, because there'd be constant squabbling. So you wanted to have some people to make some things happen, but at the same point, you didn't want to have a dictatorship, right? Now, the way that this worked was the propertied citizens voted in these assemblies, and the top of the government were these consuls. And we don't have time to talk about every single government position, the praetors, the proconsuls, and things like that. But the consuls were kind of the tops of this. And they were the leaders for the state in terms of civil affairs and military affairs, but they had set terms. So not unlike what you see now with presidential terms, these are what these guys had, right? The praetors, for example, were basically judges, but they also had some civil authority, some executive authority as well. We don't really have that kind of thing in our government anymore. The closest thing would maybe be the old justice of the peace kind of, where you can do some local judicial functions, but also you were the law enforcement officer or something like that. Don't really have this in our government now, but this is what the praetors were. Now, the Romans understood that you have all these layers of government, and you can have a lot of gridlock. So what happens if there's an emergency? What happens if something really, really bad happens? You have like a hurricane come in and destroy everything, or what happens if you have like an invading army? What if there's some kind of emergency where somebody's just got to come in and say, okay, we got to get some things done, and we got to stop arguing? And so they had this in there where you could have a dictator, right? Which was somebody that, basically the speaker, somebody that's going to come in and tell us all what to do. They could be chosen to deal with a very specific emergency. Generally speaking, though, they were only allowed a specific term of office. You had a number of other bureaucratic functions that were created, especially to administer the growing empire. Subject levels, you had governors, you had provincial officials, and so it gets kind of complicated. But the idea is that you had this bureaucracy. It was based upon the idea of spreading power out, but once you have the power based on the people, then you can act on it. Here's a good example. This is Cincinnatus, right? He was given dictatorial power because people in Rome trusted him when they were being invaded. He comes in, and then he smashes the enemy. He leads the army. He organizes everything. And then instead of sort of living it up as the dictator for however long the term of office was that he still had left, he returns the power back to the councils here in Rome. And so he is often held up as this great example. Now, one thing that we hadn't talked about yet, we talked about the assemblies, we talked about the governmental executive positions, but that was the Roman Senate. Now, technically speaking, for most of its history, the Roman Senate was only an advisory body, right? But the reality was that it held the most power of any of the government agencies because of who sat on it and their ability to use their own personal, social, and sometimes, or oftentimes, financial power to make things happen in society. Now, they were allowed to advise pretty much anybody, the magistrates, the consuls, the governors, the elected assemblies. But since these guys were all wealthy, and many of the people in the assemblies were patrons of theirs, and also they had lifetime terms, they could come in and kind of, rub people and say, listen, this is what you really need to do. And of course, in many cases, the assemblies would turn over debates for society over to the Senate itself, but these were delegated powers, right? So what happened was pretty much any individual government office holder had to defer to the Senate in practice, right? Well, like we saw when we talked about the Greeks and then some of these other civilizations around the world, you get here to the 5th century BC or so, and you're seeing a lot of social discord. And generally what it is it's friction between the middle class that's shut out of power and then the upper nobility that has the power because they're born into it. And so, in this case, the Romans, you have the patricians, right? These are the wealthy landed nobles. They have wealth, they have land, they have power, they have the political authority. And then you have the plebeians with the poor. Well, as Rome had grown and had become commercially much more successful, many of these plebeians, in fact, weren't poor. They had gained wealth, but unfortunately they didn't gain access to political power. So because of birth, they couldn't have access to political power. Well, in many cases, whether you're talking about Greece prior to the formation of tyrannies, or France with the French Revolution, in many cases what you have is a flare-ups of violence. The Romans were a much more pragmatic people, right? We've got a problem. What's the best way to do this? And that's a series of compromises. Generally speaking, through most of its history, the Romans were really, really good about saying, well, you guys want this, but we'll give you a little bit, and we'll allow ourselves to kind of adapt to these changes, right? So these series of reforms that the Roman Senate and other government agencies put through between 494 and 297 BC, right, is going to give the plebeian class a growing sense of power, this growing ability to do things. So they'll be able to pass their own laws if they want to via the plebiscita or a plebiscite, right? Or they could even serve as a consul. It used to be that, well, you guys can't be consuls. Okay, one of you can be a consul. Okay, fine, both of you can be consuls. But because this is over a really, really long period of time, a couple of hundred years, this meant that the change was gradual rather than revolutionary, right? But the power continued to remain, for the most part, in the well-connected and very wealthy Senate. So it was a big change over a long period of time, and then, of course, many of these plebeians worked their way up into the ranks of the patricians as a result of this, right? Well, one of the other problems that the Romans faced, because it's on the western coast of Italy, is it's surrounded by a lot of other city-states. Now, initially, they're probably worried about the Etruscans coming back, but over the course of time, they got a lot of neighbors, and there's this potential for conquest. And the Romans deal with these, basically the way the Romans deal with everything, which is, all right, pragmatically, what do we have to do to deal with this? Well, what's the best way to get rid of enemies? Well, you go and you knock them out. Well, you want to kill them all? No, that's not a good plan. Let's go take them over, right? But you're surrounded by enemies. What, are you going to attack them all? So what the Romans did was they fought a series of wars. And to keep the peace is they would keep these peace treaties with basically everybody but one. So they could concentrate on only one at a time. They never had to worry about fighting wars on multiple fronts against multiple enemies because they were very conscious of the fact that anybody that gives us problems, we'll keep peace treaties with them, and then we'll attack these guys, we'll knock them out, right? So by taking them on one at a time, the Romans were very successful, and they would then take over the enemy's territory. This is where the Romans, generally speaking, diverge from pretty much every civilization that we've talked about so far. A lot of places, whether you're talking about the Greeks, whether you're talking about the Romans, whether you're talking about eventually when we deal with the Mongols in China, a lot of people in a lot of different places, getting the empire is actually the easy part. Military conquest is actually not too terribly difficult. At least, it happens frequently enough to where you think, no, it's not an impossibility. The question is, how do you keep people that aren't you under control for long periods of time? The Romans came up with a very different system than what we had seen prior to this. Generally speaking, all the other answers have been various tactics towards suppression. You want to do something to suppress this foreign group that you've taken over. The Romans, basically what they did was they decided, let's turn them all into Romans. And that's what's going to happen here. They made a series of cultural compromises with these people. And they gave incentives for the conquered people to stay loyal. They kept the taxes relatively light. They also made sure that these people provided men for the Roman army. While they're in the Roman army, they're going to learn Latin, they're going to learn Roman customs, and then when they go back to their homes at the end of their army stint, they're going to say, hey, I've got connections in Rome. I was in the army. So they then helped maintain these links. So these city-states could maintain their relative autonomy. They would gain partial legal citizenship, which gained a number of legal and economic advantages. And then eventually, we'll see that loyalty could lead to full citizenship in Rome. And so it became then a better bargain for most of these places, especially when we talk about Hannibal's invasions. It would be better to stay loyal to Rome than to go off by ourselves. So here you can see the Romans in some of these early wars. There you can see some plastic soldiers going at it off to the right. And we will eventually get to the point when we talk about the Romans in terms where their army was preeminent. For a couple of centuries, 1st century BC, 1st century AD, these guys are really tops of the world. Amazingly powerful army. These guys aren't there yet. A few centuries before that, they've got a good army, but it's not really a whole lot better than anybody else, right? They're able to win because of their strategic focus on going at these guys one at a time, being very pragmatic towards what they consider to be victory. Well, by taking over these places, right, in Italy, then, okay, you guys are with us now. Well, we've got enemies on the other side that weren't next to you. They're causing us problems. No, you're with us now. Nobody's going to mess with you. And so the Romans then, they begin spiraling kind of outward throughout the Italian peninsula, taking on the enemies of their enemies, and then the enemies of their enemies, and their enemies. And so until eventually, from the Alps almost all the way down to Sicily, all of it was under Roman control. This takes a while, but what you're seeing now is an ever-expansive Rome. So while Rome is consolidating Italy, it's also expanding its commercial influence here in the Mediterranean Sea. Well, at the same time, Carthage, which was an old Phoenician city that had been founded as a trading outpost, it is growing concomitantly as well. In a lot of ways, Carthage is the Rome of Africa, right? Where you've got, Rome is in Italy, it's a Roman civilization here in Europe, and then you've got, in Africa, you've got Carthage, which is on the North African coastline, and it's been expanding its influence across North Africa and into the Mediterranean as well. Well, when you got, the old math problem, you got one train from Rome and it's headed south, and you got the other train from Carthage and it's headed north, and they're on the same track. Forget about the math. We know what's going to happen. They're going to collide. And in fact, this is exactly what's going to happen here. Both of these powers set their sights on the control of Sicily, which has a strategic location right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Well, they begin putting political inroads with the various city-states here in Sicily, and they've got commercial interests with these guys until eventually there's a squabble that's in Sicily that really doesn't have anything to do with the Romans and the Carthaginians, but then they bring in the Romans, and then these other guys on the other side bring in the Carthaginians, and this is going to lead to war. This is going to be the first of 3 Punic Wars that we'll talk about between Rome and Carthage. And if Rome has kind of a World War II moment, this is very much it, where there's going to be a lot of fighting in a lot of different places in a lot of different theaters. So you've got this war that begins here in Sicily with now both the Romans and the Carthaginians sending troops here into Sicily in order to fight. And of course, this political thing that starts has nothing to do with anything. It was the Romans looking for a reason to fight against the Carthaginians with this. And so this is what we have, right? You've got the expansion here of the Romans here in Italy. And then this is Carthage here, almost directly opposite Rome in the Mediterranean. And there's the first target, and that's going to be the island of Sicily. So the first Punic War is going to see the Romans and the Carthaginians sending troops. And they're going to send their armies in, and they clash. And then at the end of it, they're both kind of out of breath. Neither the Romans nor the Carthaginians are really going to be able to surmount the other one. That they're going to drive one or the other off the island. So it becomes this kind of bloody draw that takes place in Sicily. They just kind of ram into each other. The armies are fighting here, they're fighting there. So the details aren't terribly important, but the end of this is it doesn't look like there's going to be much of a military solution on the island of Sicily. The Romans are practical. Okay, fighting on land didn't work. We need to switch. We need to switch tactics. Well, what can we do? Well, Sicily's an island. If we could get naval control around the island, then it wouldn't matter how well the Carthaginian army fought, because we'd be able to cut them off from Carthage, and then we'd be able to land troops wherever we wanted to. Okay, well, how are we going to do this? Well, we need to be able to beat the Carthaginian navy. Whoa, the Carthaginians have a big navy. So, if we spend enough money and we apply a little Roman know-how, and essentially what the Romans did was they set up more or less what you and I would recognize as a factory production, not unlike what the United States had in World War II, where they were just cranking out these battleships here. Now they were wooden and they were ramming sort of vessels at this point in naval warfare. But that's what they did. They built this huge fleet, and in the naval engagement off the coast of Sicily, the Romans are going to win. They're going to outmatch the Carthaginians, because the Carthaginians didn't think there's no way the Romans could build a fleet that big in that short of a time. But that's exactly what happens here. Carthage understands that, okay, the jig is up, right? That they've got control now of the water around Sicily. There's no point in fighting when we have a massive disadvantage. So Carthage sends emissaries to Rome. Okay, we're suing for peace. You guys win. But this, of course, is round one, you and I know, right? In the peace treaty, Carthage is going to lose Corsica and Sardinia, which it had control before, and of course it's going to have to cede all of its claims in Sicily to the Romans. The Romans definitely win round one. Well, nobody thinks that it's over after the First War, because Carthage is using this interwar period to try to build up support all throughout the southern and western Mediterranean to try to gather its strength in order to be ready for what it knows is inevitably coming, and that's a second engagement with the Romans, right? Well, of course, the Romans see the Carthaginians move into what is now Spain, right, España, and they start moving into the region as well, if for no other reason than to deny total control of the Iberian Peninsula to the Carthaginians. There's a lot of men, there's a lot of resources, right? There's a lot of items that they can be used for warfare in this area. So the Romans want, if nothing else, deny these guys. They come to an agreement to keep the peace, and that is, well, we'll divide control over this area. Yeah, two unfriendly powers dividing control over the same area. Yeah, they're going to share and play nice. So this is not a very viable outcome. The Second Punic War is by far the biggest, at least the most dangerous for Rome of the three. We're going to have another squabble. In this case, it's going to be a squabble over territory in Spain, and this is going to start war number two, because you're going to have the Romans on one side of the disagreement, you're going to have the Carthaginians on the other side, and then, they'll disagree. Well, this means war between Carthage and Rome. So you're going to have this tiny little spark in Spain that's going to set off this huge fire between the Carthaginians and the Romans. Well, the Carthaginians, because of the power now of the Roman navy, are going to have to change their strategies. They want to attack Rome directly. The plan is, though, you're going to have to send these guys overland through the northern part of the Mediterranean, and then, of course, over the Alps, right? These huge mountains that are protecting the Italian peninsula from the north. The Romans, of course, thought the Alps were impenetrable to a foreign army. The mountains are too high, the passes are too narrow. They're not going to be able to get through this. But you're going to see that the plan here for the Carthaginian army is not only to get through, but once you get into northern Italy, they have a similar idea to what Alexander the Great had in dealing with the Persian Empire, and that was you start peeling away the Roman city-state allies piece by piece. Hey, I'm the new power in the area, you guys join me. And so over the course of time, the Carthaginians were hoping that their army would get bigger and bigger rather than frittering away its strength as they go forward, right? The Carthaginian commander's name was a guy called Hannibal, who had a deep-seated hatred for the Romans, right? Well, Hannibal's army, it succeeds in doing what the Romans didn't really think was possible, and that is crossing the Alps into a great big army. Many of his men were, in fact, professionals, and according to at least some accounts, were elephants. A lot of people, no, they didn't have elephants. They started out with elephants, but the elephants died in the Alps because can you really see elephants in the mountains? But I'm a romantic at heart, and so, why not, right? Why not elephants, right? Now, in the early engagements, the Romans, they send out these armies, and they get smacked around, right? And so the Romans are defeated, and they're pushed backwards. But what happens next is not what Hannibal expected. He expected to win some battles against the Roman army, and then go to these northern Italian city-states and say, hey, all right, see, I'm the new power. The Romans can't protect you. You should join with me. And they say, no. No, we're still with Rome. because essentially by this point a lot of them had become, if not completely Romanized, enough to realize that they were Roman more than they were Carthaginian, right? And so the Romans had developed a policy that was pretty pragmatic, although not very macho, right? And that was, we're going to send out an army and we'll kind of harass Hannibal, and we'll keep him moving, we'll keep him out in the countryside, and we'll try to keep him away from the city of Rome, right? And we'll use these delaying tactics because we know that his army is really, really dangerous. But let's not engage in an actual pitched battle because we don't want to get destroyed. Well, there was a strong disagreement, right, between the two consuls. One was pro-war, let's go after the Carthaginians, let's really just hammer them. The other, no, let's just keep them busy. Well, what's going to happen is this acrimony politically gets so bad that the only way that they can operate is, okay, one guy's in charge one day and the other guy's in charge the other day. Well, the guy who's really, really aggressive decides that Hannibal's army's close enough and he's going to march on him and they're going to meet at a place called Cannae, all right? The Romans are going to get totally and utterly destroyed here. So much so that the word Cannae is still synonymous in military circles with a battle where one side gets completely destroyed by the other one, right? Only a few Romans managed to flee and get away from the battle. Hannibal is going to completely eliminate this Roman army. Well, the Romans learned their lesson kind of the hard way, right? And they decide to stick to the delaying tactics to try to keep Hannibal's army as far out into the countryside as possible. He's unable to attack Rome itself because of the walled city around it. He doesn't have time to kind of lay siege to it, build the equipment necessary to breach the wall. So he has to move from northern Italy into central Italy into southern Italy. Finally, some of these southern Italian city-states, they decide, okay, they had been Romanized the most recently and of course to the least degree. They decide, okay, we'll rebel against Rome. But Rome's delaying tactics had finally worked. See, Hannibal had had no effective way to replace the few men that he's losing here and there. And as I mentioned, he doesn't have the equipment to breach these walled cities. So what happens here is the Romans can then deal with these rebellious cities one at a time. And when I say deal with, they deal with them, okay? If you guys ever seen a mafia movie, when you cross the boss man and he comes back and they start breaking knees and shooting people in the head? Okay, it's sort of like that, except with Romans, right? So there's Hannibal's army. It's trying to cross through the Alps. There's some elephants. Like I said, why not? This is a diagram here of the Battle of Cannae, right? And this is the trap that Hannibal sets for the Roman army, where they start out in this convex formation and then eventually gives ground into a concave formation. His cavalry overloads it until it eventually breaches this, until because they push into this gap, right, they are then going to be getting attacked on all sides by Hannibal's army until eventually, ironically, it's the stout guy who, Paulus, who had said, no, we really need to not go after these guys. He's the one that gets killed, and Navarro, he's the idiot who pitched into this. He manages to escape. So there's no justice for the Romans at the Battle of Cannae, right? So the Romans resecured the Italian holdings as best as they could, but Hannibal's army's kind of still out there. One of the things that the Romans had kind of realized was, okay, we're going to have to attack the Carthaginians, but we can't attack Hannibal directly. That guy's really, really dangerous, okay? So we got to find some way to get Hannibal out of Italy. His army's too big, it's too powerful. And so what you'll see is they changed their strategic focus, right? Scipio, a guy who eventually, because of his victory in Africa, will be known as Scipio Africanus, right? He's sent to attack the Carthaginian holdings in Spain. So you're trying to cut the tree down by cutting its kind of legs out from under it, right? And he manages to retake Spain, which is going to weaken the Carthaginian holdings in the Western Mediterranean. And the final phase of the campaign is Scipio is going to march on Carthage itself, right? He's going to land these forces in North Africa. This is going to force the Carthaginian government to recall Hannibal and say, look, you got to get back here. The capital is under assault. Well, of course, in the tumult of trying to move his army from southern Italy all the way down to North Africa, a lot of these guys are lost. They've got to try to get through the Roman blockade. And so the army that Hannibal now has is a much more weakened force, and Scipio does something that no Roman general had been able to do, and that is to defeat Hannibal. Carthage is completely defeated now, and they are forced to admit defeat. All right? Scipio comes back and is regarded as an absolute hero. This makes a great deal of sense when you consider the fact that the Roman people, for a while, were looking directly at the people that were going to supposedly conquer them and take them over. The Carthaginians had destroyed a number of their armies. They had threatened to pull their holdings in Italy apart. They had come a breath away from being defeated and conquered. So when Scipio arrives, he is given this hero worship as a great general. It starts he gets this triumph through the streets, right? And this is going to be something that Scipio probably likes a whole lot. Yeah, I'm a great guy, right? He earns the nickname Africanus because of his great victory in Africa, right? But he doesn't really use this to much political advantage. You know, he could have said, hey, I should be in charge of a whole lot of stuff because I'm really, really awesome. And people probably would have done that. Instead, he kind of retires from public life, right? But there are going to be future generals that are going to notice this, that, hey, military success could very well equal political power as long as I'm willing to apply a little torque to the situation. Well, the Romans are still very afraid of a Carthaginian revival after this Hannibal scare, right? So you'll see that a number of these senators, they urge for this campaign to go in and punish, right, the Carthaginians, that they got to go and destroy it. And so finally the Romans had used a pretext with their peace treaty. The Carthaginians weren't allowed to declare war on anybody without Rome's approval. Zama or somebody else they declare war on, and they go after these Carthaginians, and they go in and they wreck the city, right? They destroy it. The legend is that they sow salt in the fields. That probably didn't happen, but they do such a great job of smashing it that Carthage, still to this day, is at best a tourist site. So you can see this medieval print here of the assault on Carthage, and then this is what you'll see when you get off the tour bus to go look at Carthage today. It's been wrecked pretty well as a result of this, right? Well, Hannibal had also made alliances with some of these Greek city-states who were starting to fear the growing power of Rome in the Western Mediterranean, or worried they're going to get involved there. Well, you know, Rome, they make a little mental sticky note of people that get involved in their business. And so once the war with the Carthaginians are over, Rome can turn its attention toward the Greeks. And they'll go after a few of these Greek city-states that are there. They conquer them until eventually they've got to deal with the other Greek city-states who don't want to have the Romans there. And so you guys have seen this kind of process before where the Romans deal with the enemies of their enemies. You just take them all over. And that's what the Romans are going to do. So by 133 BC or so, Rome had taken over pretty much all of Greece. One of these Greek city-states, Corinth, and well, we don't like, we're Greek, we're free, we're supposed to be independent. They rebel against Rome, and so the Romans sent in the legionnaires, and they repressed this rebellion rather brutally. Bad. People with their brains hanging out. I mean, the Romans beat these people into submission, and I don't mean that as a euphemism, I mean actual beatings. Okay? Now, what you're seeing here is the Romans, the Western Mediterranean, Africa and Europe, is kind of in their hands at this point, right? They're starting to get a pretty good foothold here in the Eastern Mediterranean with the conquest of Greece. So it looks like, you know, Rome's got this massive expansionist program going on, but actually these were not well-planned campaigns. Okay, we've taken over North Africa, what are we going to do now? Looks like Greece is next on our checklist. No, it really wasn't like that. What it was, you know, anybody that gets involved in our business, anybody that attacks us, we go and we attack them and we knock them out. Well, then anybody that's causing them problems, right, because taking over a new area brings a whole new set of political issues, you go and you take them over. And so it was kind of more of a haphazard set of expansionism. And the Roman Senate, for example, at many points, they could legitimately claim, well, all we've been doing is fighting a series of defensive wars, which wasn't totally true, but it was sort of true, right? And eventually what you'll see is using this process, they'll go completely into the east, and they will conquer all the Greek kingdoms of Alexander's making, to where they're going to go all the way from London in kind of the northwest to Baghdad in the southeast. Well, whenever you have a lot of wealth, and whenever you have a lot of power, we've seen this kind of situation before, and that is people begin to bicker over the spoils of war. And in this case, these Romans and these various Italian city-states, hey, we've sent men, we've sent money, we paid taxes, you know, how come the city of Rome gets all the advantages over this, right? Well, the Romans eventually will extend, okay, you guys will have full citizenship to everybody here in the Italian peninsula itself, and you'll see that a lot of other people outside the Italian peninsula will be able to get Roman citizenship through various means. But ever increasingly, politics was taking a turn, right? And that popularity with the people is what ever increasingly is being perceived as the great political engine. Right? Well, a number of wars had been raging in the East. And one of these people that the Senate is really, really worried about is the very popular General Sulla. They're worried about him not so much in terms of his popularity with his men in his army, because that's fine. They're worried that his popularity with his men and the people means that he eventually is going to take over as a dictator. So that's one of the things that they worry about. And so they voted to remove this guy. They voted this, okay, Sulla, you're no longer the general of this army anymore. despite the fact that Sulla hadn't lost a lot of battles or anything like that. Well, Sulla has a political point now to prove, and he tells his men, hey, this is unjust. He takes his army to Rome, then marches on it and captures it, and says basically, okay, look, you guys shouldn't have done this. This was against, the rules. But he's kind of broken the rules himself. You're not supposed to take over the place because you got a political beef, right? But he figures he's made his point, and he returns with his army in the east. Well, his opponents, many of them had fled town. They begin gathering forces themselves, and Sulla's very worried that they're not going to come after him with force. So Sulla returns to Rome, and he recaptures the capital. This time, though, he doesn't play around. He forces the Senate to name him the dictator, and then he starts killing off political opponents. Right? He starts dealing with these people. There are actually lists that were published of people that should be turned in for execution. And one of the things that he wants to see is this process, which ever increasingly was this kind of what he thought was mob rule, where these elected assemblies, they get kind of whipped up into whoever the hero of the day is, and that the Senate itself should actually have a lot more power all on its own. Sulla then resigns as dictator. He goes off on to retirement. But what he had done was, in trying to fix the Roman government, he had pretty much fatally broken it, because this proved to be a pretty bad precedent of what a Roman general could do with his army in terms of building political support and then, if necessary, seizing power. There's Sulla on the left and on the right. He did have a nose. It's just the bust here that lost the nose. He even made it onto the coinage, right? And so you can see the inscription for those of you, if you want to tilt your head, right? There's Sulla, right? Instead of fixing Rome back to the way that it had been, where the assemblies and the Senate kind of worked together and there was power sharing, essentially they had gotten used to him being the dictator, and then when he leaves power, he doesn't stay the way that it was. People begin looking for the next great executive, right? So there's a power vacuum as Sulla leaves office. You'll see that a couple of major generals at this point, Pompey and Crassus, they become the consuls, and they become the leaders of the Roman state, and they begin to try to give the elected assemblies and the well-connected people their power back, because that's their conveyance of political power as well. Now, the Senate is going to object to this. They say, no, we should have kind of this even hand on things. But to get them in line, Pompey and Crassus is going to add a third member, Julius Caesar, as we would call him in English, who would become a popular general in his own right, to their coalition. So these guys were very wealthy, popular, they're politically powerful, they're militarily supported, and they became the first of what were known as the triumvirate, or the rule of three men, right? And they're going to hold the most power in the state. Now we got to back up a little bit, because this guy, Julius Caesar, deserves more than just a line or two in our discussion. Caesar understands that military power, right, is where you gain a lot of political support. He was originally inexperienced in war. He wasn't a general since he was a kid. He didn't have a lot of time campaigning. And so what you're going to see is Caesar knows that he's got to get his feet wet in the military circles in order to make a big splash in political circles. So he basically gets this army together, and he leads a successful campaign in putting down rebellions in Spain. He is then ordered north, right, into what was known as Gaul. You and I would call it France now, right, to put down some of these rebellions along the Roman and Gallic border, right? Cisalpine Gaul is what it was called. And he was supposed to be kind of in that area. So instead of just putting down rebellions there, he marches into all of Gaul and takes it over. Right? So he kind of goes beyond his mandate. Now, his Gallic campaign is a bloody affair, but nobody who knows anything about military campaigning says that it's anything other than brilliance. Right? It earned a great deal of respect for his army. Right? He captures a huge hoard of loot and land, and more importantly, he sends hundreds of thousands of slaves to Rome, with a great deal of then economic output as well. The Senate at this point is extremely afraid of his popularity, right? And says, okay, you can't march back to Rome and have your triumph, right? You need to disband your army before you cross the Rubicon River, right? Caesar says no. The Senate now is really, really worried, and we're also going to see that Pompey and Crassus, who kind of, I thought this guy was with us, it looks like he's out for himself. The Senate calls on Pompey to say, okay, it looks like Caesar's going to march on Rome the same as Sulla did and take it over. We need you to come and help us, right? This is Vercingetorix, the Gallic commander, and he's, you can see the great Roman engineering that they're besieging his fortress. and he's going to go in here and he's going to surrender to Caesar, and eventually, along with the rest of the Gauls, be taken off into captivity, right? Caesar decides that this is an unjust law, right? He breaks the law and he crosses the Rubicon River into Italy and marches into Rome, right? He says that the die is cast. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He gets his triumph, but Pompey doesn't have his military together quite yet, right? And so he withdraws his forces here to Greece in order to build up support there. Caesar, who doesn't want to see him do that, chases after him. He goes into Greece, and they're going to fight here as well. And Pompey is going to get away, right? He manages to flee all the way down to Egypt, but the Egyptians don't want to have anything to do with this guy, and he dies here in Egypt. So we've already had now a couple of civil wars, right? Caesar is going to return to Rome. He probably would have really liked to have Pompey with him to add political support. And he says, okay, we've got this emergency. The government has spun out of control. You know, we've got to do something to keep an even hand on this. What Caesar would have done with all this power, how he would have restructured the Roman state, we don't know, okay? He is made dictator for life, but the reality of this is he's got a great deal of popularity with people in the street, and of course he's extremely popular with his army, who can see what he could do as a military commander, right? Now the senators are extremely upset with this guy for a usurpation of power. It's one thing to be a dictator and to say there's an emergency. It's another thing to basically say, there's going to be an emergency for the whole rest of my life. Wow, right? Now this is a big difference with this. And you also have the people in the streets, they're shouting Rex, Rex at him, which is king in Latin. They want him to be the king, and of course a lot of these senators he's going to set up a monarchy for himself. We're not supposed to have a monarchy. It's supposed to be a republic, right? So they're extremely worried about this when, of course, Caesar announces, okay, I'm going to be leaving Rome, and I'm going to be heading east, and I'm going to finish these wars here against these people in the far eastern part of our empire. And it's one thing to have to put up with Caesar, who, let's face it, he was a war hero. It's another thing to say, well, we're going to have to listen to his corrupt ministers, because they're